The rain had begun in the way English rain often did, too softly to notice, too steadily to escape. It slid in quiet sheets along the tall windows of Chiswick House, blurring the view of the gardens into a gentle wash of grey-green. Inside, the air smelled of varnish, lilies, and the faintest trace of turpentine, the result of Lady Alicia Trenery's grand autumn exhibition, an event intended to display both her wealth and her taste with equal flourish. It was, in truth, less an exhibition than a gathering of London's more polished egotists, painters, patrons, dilettantes, and those who hovered somewhere ambiguously between. They drifted with a certain stylized ease from one gallery room to the next, their conversations low and polished, their glances more cutting than their words. From Inspector Roderick Allen's vantage near the tall marble fireplace, the company resembled a slow-moving constellation, its stars glittering not with warmth but with the hard brightness of social necessity. He had not been invited as a detective. Officially, he was there as a guest. Lady Alicia insisted upon it. Unofficially, he suspected she enjoyed the faint ripple his presence caused. It was fashionable these days to claim one had entertained a Scotland Yard man of a layman's reputation, particularly when the threat of scandal heightened the flavor of any gathering. Nothing truly scandalous was expected to occur, of course. Lady Alicia prided herself on her guest lists as well as her upholstery. Alain watched the room with casual interest, taking care not to appear as though he was watching at all. A tall man in evening dress, he blended with ease among the crowd. The refinement of his features softened the acuity of his glance. His courteous half-smile made it difficult to suspect he was already forming quiet impressions. The centerpiece of the exhibition, if the murmurs were to be believed, was the newest work of the evening's most restless character. Adrian Grant, the temperamental painter whose genius fluctuated with the tides of his humor. The portrait, titled Winter Without End, hung at the end of the East Gallery, its colors a somber spread of grays and greens that echoed the weather beyond the windows. Some guests called it brilliant. Others muttered that it was an affront to optimism. Lady Alicia had once declared it utterly arresting, which, in her vocabulary, meant it was fashionable enough to defend, but objectionable enough to be interesting. Adrian himself stood near the painting now, lean and restless, flicking ashes from his cigarette onto an empty silver tray. His dark hair fell in waves over his brow. His eyes were too quick, too restless. The young actress, Clara Sewell, hovered beside him, her pale silk gown gleaming faintly under the gallery lights. She looked up at Adrian often, as though fearful he might vanish like a stage illusion. Her nearness suggested devotion. Her silence suggested something more complicated. From across the gallery, Sir Bertram Hollingwell observed them with an expression of genteel disapproval. He was an older man whose estate bordered Lady Alicia's, and whose sense of propriety bordered on the absolute. His waxed mustache quivered faintly whenever Adrian laughed too loudly, or Clara leaned in too closely. Sir Bertram's wife, the delicately spoken Lady Margaret, stood beside him with a serenity that seemed almost pointed. She looked at Clara with the half-pitying softness of a woman who had once been young, admired, and unprepared. The conversations drifted like smoke. Compliments landed with too much polish. Laughter came in careful doses. Beneath it all, Alain sensed a curious undercurrent, nothing so dramatic as tension, but a subtle discordance, as though each guest carried a small, private note of unease. Lady Alicia herself swept into his proximity with the well-practiced grace of a woman whose entrance was always a kind of performance. "My dear Aline," she breathed, extending her hand with gloved elegance, "do tell me you are enjoying yourself. One does try." "I assure you, Lady Alicia," he replied, bowing his head slightly, "your gatherings seldom fail to provide interest." "Interest?" She laughed lightly, fanning herself with a program. "I trust that doesn't mean suspicion." "Not at all, merely observation." "Which is far more alarming," she teased. You notice the things none of us intend to reveal." He smiled. "I doubt anything here requires revealing." "Ah, but you'd be surprised." Her eyes traveled across the room, to Adrian, to Clara, to Sir Bertram's rigid disapproval, before returning to him. "Human beings have an unfortunate way of producing little dramas when least convenient." The rain pressed harder against the windows. A footman passed with champagne. A string quartet in the far drawing room shifted delicately into a new phrase. The scene was tasteful, serene, and, to the casual observer, entirely harmonious. But Aline was not a casual observer, and as he watched the gallery's guests orbit one another with fragile poise, he felt, with the faintest stir of intuition, that one of these quiet, elegant figures would soon step beyond the line of social discord into darker territory. Something was brewing behind these smiles. Something quiet, something inevitable. The rain had thickened by evening into a persistent drizzle that made the gravel of the Chiswick house drive slick and glimmering. Inside, the soft murmur of conversation persisted, but the gallery rooms felt subtly emptier. Groups had broken into smaller clusters, seeking quiet corners where the words could carry meaning beyond the polite surface. Aline, still stationed near the central fireplace, noted the subtle shifting of alliances and discomforts. Clara Sewell had moved to the far side of the gallery, her gaze intermittently drawn to the portrait of winter without, and Adrian Grant's restless presence no longer at her side. A sudden ripple of unease passed through the gathering when a discreet knock came from the adjoining study. The footman, polite yet hesitant, whispered to Lady Alicia, who nodded briskly. Moments later, she returned, her composed mask taut with a faint tension. "Please," she said, her voice measured, "I'm afraid there has been an incident. Mr. Grant has been found unwell in his private study. Could you accompany me, Inspector Allen?" Alain inclined his head and followed with the same quiet, unobtrusive air he had maintained throughout the evening. The study door, a paneled structure of dark mahogany, was closed, and a faint, almost imperceptible scent, something floral, perhaps Adrian's own aftershave, mingled with a sharp metallic tang, escaped from beneath it. Lady Alicia paused at the threshold, gloved hand hovering over the knob. "I hesitate to alarm our guests," she murmured. "But—" her voice tapered, leaving the conclusion unspoken. Inside, the room was empty of theatrics. Adrian Grant lay slumped in an overstuffed leather armchair beside the fireplace. The air was unnervingly still. His cigarette had burned to a short stub in the ashtray. The half-empty glass of brandy on the side table shimmered with an untouched amber liquid. The artist's head tilted slightly to one side. His eyes closed, lips parted in an expression that might have been exhaustion if not for the pallor of his complexion. Alain approached carefully, noting details with a surgeon's detachment. No struggle, no overturned furniture, no signs of violence. A delicate handkerchief lay neatly folded on the arm of the chair, its pattern not obscured by soot or ash. Alain's trained eyes caught the faintest tremor of a recently disturbed carpet edge, the almost imperceptible smear of moisture near the hearth. Every small observation suggested order, yet hinted at unnatural finality. The inspector's attention drifted to the objects in the room, the arrangement of brushes on a small table, the untouched sketchpad, the portrait of Lady Alicia herself on the far wall. Each item seemed absurdly mundane in contrast to the quiet horror of the scene. Alain knew the key question was not what had happened, but how such an outwardly calm room could contain death. Lady Alicia stood back, her gloved fingers lightly gripping the edge of the doorway. Her face, usually composed, betrayed a flicker of unease. "It cannot be sudden," she whispered. Alain inclined his head slightly, observing the set of her lips and the tension in her shoulders. "It would appear so, Lady Alicia, but suddenness may take many forms." He glanced around the room once more. The lock on the door had been turned from within, a simple mechanism, yet sufficient to ensure that no casual intruder could have entered. No windows were open. The room radiated civility and meticulous order, a perfection that contrasted with the imperceptible, disturbing signs of something amiss. Footsteps approached along the polished floors. A servant appeared, his expression careful, almost rehearsed. He stopped short of the room, acknowledging Alain with a curt nod, but saying nothing. Alain noted the hesitation, the almost imperceptible glance toward the armchair. There was knowledge in that silence, restrained and deliberate. Clara Sewell's presence at the door drew Alain's attention next. She had not entered. Her face, pale and almost translucent in the gallery light, bore an expression of stunned incomprehension. Her fingers clutched the folds of her gown, as if seeking a fragment of composure. Alain observed her quietly. Her stillness, her controlled breathing suggested a woman both terrified and measured, a combination that often hid the most complex truths. The inspector stepped back, closing his notebook without a word, allowing the room its stillness. Death, in this quiet and controlled fashion, did not scream. It whispered. And in that whisper, Alain already sensed the beginning of a puzzle that would not reveal itself easily, one requiring patience, insight, and an unerring attention to the subtleties of human behavior. Outside, the rain continued to fall, tracing soft rivulets down the window panes. Inside, Chiswick House maintained its veneer of elegance. Yet beneath the refined air, something had shifted. The evening, poised delicately on the edge of normalcy, had fractured, silently, irrevocably. And Inspector Alain, as ever, took note. The study door remained closed behind him, leaving the hum of the gallery a distant echo. Alain lingered for a moment in the dimly lit corridor, the faint smell of rain mingling with the lingering metallic tang of the room he had just left. He did not hurry. In his experience, haste was the enemy of understanding. What he required was observation, patience, and a subtle attentiveness to human nuance that often revealed more than any frantic questioning. Returning to the gallery, Alain allowed himself the measured indulgence of scanning the room without immediate interruption. Lady Alicia had resumed her post by the fireplace, yet her composure seemed frayed at the edges. She greeted each arrival with the practiced smile of a hostess, aware that appearances must be maintained even in moments of private anxiety. Clara Sewell stood near the east window, the drizzle casting a shifting pattern of light across her pale gown. She held herself rigidly, as if the slightest movement might betray her inner turbulence. Alain noted her fingers, tight against her side, the knuckles pale, and the way her gaze frequently flicked toward the door of Adrian Grant's study. A casual observer might have dismissed her unease as theatrical, the expected emotion of a young actress confronted with misfortune. Alain did not. Sir Bertram Hollingwell lingered near the mantel, a glass of brandy poised precisely at his lips. His stance was impeccable, but his eyes darted with careful calculation from one guest to another, assessing reactions, measuring propriety. There was a faint line of tension across his forehead, an imperceptible stiffening in the shoulders, which suggested a man accustomed to control, now uncertain of its extent. Alain's attention drifted next to Lady Margaret, Sir Bertram's wife. Her serenity appeared unshaken, but in the slightest shift of her posture, in the nearly imperceptible tightening around her mouth, he sensed a private agitation, subtle, polite, almost imperceptible, the type of emotional signal that could only be decoded with careful observation. Across the room, a small group had gathered near the portrait of Winter Without End. Their conversation was low, seemingly innocuous. Yet Alain noted the intermittent glances at the closed study door, the brief, imperceptible stiffening whenever Adrian Grant's name was mentioned. Each movement, each pause, offered a fragment of the story. The challenge was to assemble these fragments without forcing disclosure. Alain approached the center of the gallery, his tall figure unassuming yet commanding in its quiet presence. He allowed his eyes to drift from one guest to another, studying expressions and gestures that, to anyone else, might have appeared ordinary. He noted the way a hand lingered too long over a champagne glass, how a shoulder slumped with controlled fatigue, the almost imperceptible sigh barely audible to a casual listener. Lady Alicia approached him with deliberate grace, lowering her voice. "You are quite calm, Inspector," she said. "It is reassuring, though I confess I feel unnerved." "It is easier to understand a room," Alain replied gently, "when one does not attempt to rearrange its pieces." He allowed a pause, letting the words settle. "People reveal far more than objects ever can." She nodded, her eyes flicking toward Clara Sewell. "Do you think she suspects?" Alain said nothing immediately. He studied the young actress from a distance, noting her poised restraint, her careful attention to the other guests, and the undercurrent of fear barely masked by cultivated elegance. Then he inclined his head slightly. Fear is often more instructive than confession. The string quartet in the far drawing room shifted to a minor key, a melancholy phrase that drew murmurs of appreciation from some, while others seemed to listen in quiet contemplation. Alain allowed himself a faint smile. Music often revealed as much as spoken words, he reflected. And tonight, the room was speaking in whispers, in silences, in glances, and in the small, measured tensions of its inhabitants. He observed the footmen and housemaids with equal care. Their faces were polite, attentive, yet the smallest hesitation betrayed a knowledge they were unwilling to voice. Alain filed the observation silently. In households such as this, those who served most closely often held the clearest picture of private dynamics, knowledge carefully concealed beneath layers of courtesy and restraint. Alain's glance returned to the study door. It was closed, perfectly so, and yet somehow the very presence of the lock seemed to hum with implication. The death within was quiet, orderly, almost gentle in its finality. But the ripples it sent through the social fabric of the room were already evident, subtle and unspoken. He made no immediate inquiry. Instead, he allowed the atmosphere to speak, cataloguing the unspoken, noting the fissures beneath cultivated smiles. Questions, he knew, would come later. For now, the gallery, the guests, and the quiet, sealed study beyond were enough to set his mind to work. Alain had learned long ago that observation, patient, unhurried, nearly invisible, was the most powerful tool. Tonight, it promised to reveal truths that words might never touch. By the time the last notes of the string quartet faded into the polished silence of the gallery, the initial shock of Adrian Grant's death had begun to settle into a delicate tension, an invisible but pervasive weight in the room. Alain moved quietly among the guests, his manner unobtrusive. Yet his presence suggested a subtle authority that neither demanded nor intimidated. Conversations shifted as he approached, polite remarks tinged with a new awareness, a faint undercurrent of caution. He began with Lady Alicia, who had returned to her accustomed poise, though the faint pallor in her cheeks betrayed the strain beneath her composed exterior. "Lady Alicia," he said softly, inclining his head, "I hope you will forgive my intrusion, but I must ask, was Mr. Grant feeling unwell prior to this evening?" She paused, her gloved fingers lightly tracing the edge of a marble console. "Unwell? I cannot say that he seemed so. Adrian was, as ever, spirited, sometimes irritable, sometimes contemplative, but entirely well enough, I believed. We all presumed his eccentricities to be merely temperament." Her voice wavered almost imperceptibly before regaining its measured cadence. Alain nodded, allowing a brief silence. "Eccentricities often conceal more than temperament," he said gently. He observed her reaction closely. No denial, no defensiveness, simply a fleeting shadow across her expression before it was carefully composed. Moving on, he approached Sir Bertram Hollingwell, who was studying a portrait with the meticulous scrutiny of a man accustomed to commanding his surroundings. "Sir Bertram," Alain began, "did you notice anything unusual in Mr. Grant's behavior today? Perhaps interactions that struck you as incongruous?" Sir Bertram's eyes lifted slowly, meeting the inspector's gaze with deliberate steadiness. "Incongruous? One might say that all of Adrian Grant's behavior is incongruous," he replied, a faint wryness beneath the formal tone. "But nothing beyond what one might expect from a man of his particular sensibilities. One observes, one tolerates. That is society." Alain inclined his head, noting the carefully controlled phrasing. "Indeed," he said softly, "observing, tolerating, yet perhaps remembering details that others overlook." "Certainly," Sir Bertram murmured, returning to his study of the portrait, though Alain caught the slight tightening of the jaw, the flicker of a restless hand beneath his cuff. Next, he approached Clara Sewell, whose pale gaze remained fixed on the closed study door. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. I cannot understand it," she said. "He seemed fine. I mean, yesterday, even this afternoon, everything was ordinary. Nothing warned us." Alain allowed the briefest pause, his gaze never leaving her face. "Extraordinary events rarely announce themselves, Miss Sewell. It is often in the smallest gestures, the smallest breaks in habit, that one discovers meaning." She shivered faintly, pressing her gloved hands together. "I suppose, perhaps there were small things I did not notice, but nothing to suggest the end was near." Alain finished softly, his tone neutral, almost conversational. He gave her a courteous nod before stepping back. His purpose was not to frighten, but to observe the shadow lines beneath fear. Alain then turned his attention to the room itself, to the silent servants whose presence was constant but understated. A footman lingered near the doorway, eyes fixed yet respectful. Alain approached him, adopting the quiet tone that encouraged discretion rather than fear. "You observed the study, I presume?" he said gently. "Anything out of the ordinary?" The footman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Nothing that could be spoken, sir," he murmured. His gaze flicked subtly toward the marble hearth and then toward the closed door. Alain noted the careful restraint, the silent loyalty and discretion that spoke volumes without words. Alain's method was simple. Speak lightly. Allow the responses to reveal hesitation, tone, and omission. He asked no direct questions about motive, no pointed interrogations. The truth often resided not in declarations, but in what the polished exterior could not entirely conceal. As he moved through the room again, Alain catalogued the subtle fractures, furtive glances, small hesitations, gestures that betrayed concern or restraint. Each interaction, each quietly measured exchange, was a thread in the tapestry of character that would, eventually, guide him to understanding. By the time he paused near the portrait of Winter Without End, Alain sensed that the evening had shifted. The guests carried the weight of unease with the careful civility demanded by social expectation. No one had raised a voice, yet every movement was now guided by the awareness of absence. The absence of life, the presence of death, and the subtle knowledge that all was not as it should be. Alain observed, and he knew that observation, quiet, patient, unhurried, was only the first stage in the gathering of truths. Alain found the household staff gathered in the discreet corridor adjoining the gallery and kitchen, a subtle retreat removed from the eyes of the more conspicuous guests. Their movements were precise, as though choreographed by years of training in the art of unobtrusive service. The footmen stood with hands neatly clasped. The housemaids shifted from foot to foot with almost imperceptible hesitation. Each face bore the practiced neutrality expected of servants in households of taste and means. Yet, as Alain observed, there was a uniform tension, small, controlled, and deliberate, a signal of knowledge carefully withheld. He addressed them gently, with the courteous attention that disarmed without patronizing. "Good evening," he began, nodding to the head butler, Mr. Crittenden, whose tall, stooped frame radiated authority through a quiet, dignified presence. "I would not wish to impose unduly, but I am interested in the household's observations tonight. Minor details, oddities, anything you think might help explain Mr. Grant's condition." Crittenden's eyes, pale and watchful beneath furrowed brows, flicked briefly toward the study door. "Sir," he said carefully, "the master's habits are known to us all. Every morning, precisely at 10, he reviews his sketches. Every evening, precisely at 7:30, he closes the studio window to avoid damp. These things we notice. But nothing unusual occurred today, sir. At least, nothing that need be remarked aloud." Alain inclined his head, noting the restraint in both phrasing and posture. "You are careful, understandably. Yet sometimes subtle departures from routine reveal far more than obvious disturbances." The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, a small, precise woman with iron-grey hair, added quietly, "It is the little things, Inspector. The timing of a footstep, a missing brush, a door left slightly ajar. Sometimes one senses a change without ever naming it, but discretion is essential." Alain's gaze lingered on her face, catching the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, the subtle narrowing of the eyes that betrayed more than the words themselves. "You sense change," he murmured, "but choose not to voice it. Prudence can be instructive, but occasionally it conceals truth." A young footman, anxious and pale, shifted nervously. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice, "we saw Miss Sewell outside the study just before it happened. She knocked lightly, then waited. We didn't intervene. It seemed private." Alain nodded, filing the information without comment. It was precisely the kind of detail that the well-trained household retained. Fragments of circumstance, carefully observed but rarely spoken, hidden behind propriety. "Thank you," he said softly. "Your discretion is valued." He noticed the subtle hierarchy in their responses, the deference of the younger staff, the restrained candor of those with long tenure. There was no malice, no complicity beyond careful observation and discretion. Yet the small fissures in their composure spoke volumes. They knew more than they revealed, not from fear of punishment, but from the ingrained understanding of their place in the household's social order. Alain moved closer to the group, his voice low, almost conversational. "You understand, of course, that the truth will come to light, eventually. And it is often those who observe in silence who hold the clearest picture. Yet discretion may be a form of loyalty, just as silence may protect the fragile elegance of the household. You act rightly." Mrs. Fenwick's lips pressed together, and for a moment the faintest shadow crossed her face. "Yes, sir, that is true." Alain allowed the pause to stretch, noting each subtle gesture, the nervous adjustment of cuffs, the fleeting glance toward the gallery, the careful avoidance of eye contact with one another. Each motion, minute though it was, sketched the outlines of a story unsaid. From his vantage, it was clear that the servants were not merely passive observers. They were participants in a silent network of information and restraint, guardians of knowledge that might otherwise disrupt the delicate social fabric. Their knowledge was precise, intimate, and unspoken. Alain stepped back, his hands clasped behind him, and allowed the group their quiet authority. In his mind, the details they withheld were as valuable as any confession. As he left them, returning to the gallery, Alain understood the subtle rhythm of the household. Everything was observed, nothing wasted, yet much concealed. The servants knew, they always did. And in the quiet of Chiswick House, Alan felt that these unspoken truths would be crucial in piecing together the circumstances of Adrian Grant's death. Alain returned to the study once more, this time unhurried and deliberate, guided not by urgency, but by a quiet, methodical curiosity. The room itself remained almost untouched, a still life of domestic order that belied the extraordinary event it had witnessed. Chairs were in place, the fireplace unaltered, and the small table by Adrian Grant's armchair bore the untouched brandy and stubbed cigarette of the earlier hour. Yet, within this careful arrangement, Alan had learned that the most telling clue was often hidden in patterns, small rituals, habitual gestures, and routines known intimately to those who dwelled within the household. He began with the fireplace, scanning its polished brass tools and noting the precise alignment of the poker and tongs. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet the hearth, he observed, bore a faint smear of ash. Not a careless scattering, but a subtle shift from its habitual neatness. The difference was imperceptible to any but the most observant eye. But Alain, trained to see such minutiae, stored the observation silently in his mind. His attention drifted to the arrangement of brushes and paints on the side table. Adrian Grant had been meticulous, almost obsessive in their placement. Tonight, one brush had been shifted slightly, angled toward the sketch pad in a manner that suggested either haste or interference. Alain's eyes lingered, noting the subtle tilt of the bristles, the almost imperceptible fleck of dried paint displaced from its customary position. He walked slowly around the room, examining the floorboards, the polished desk, and the shelves of bound sketchbooks. Each object, each habitual position, spoke a language of pattern that the casual observer would have ignored. And then, at the corner of the room, Alain noticed the faintest impression in the carpet. An indentation that suggested someone had knelt or crouched near the window, a deviation from normal routine. It was slight, yet precise, a signature of movement out of step with the household's known rhythm. Alain's gaze settled on the window itself. Closed, latched, and untouched in appearance, yet he observed the small wisp of dampness at the lower frame, a trace of rain, perhaps, or the residue of a hand that had lingered longer than custom dictated. This, in combination with the displaced brush and the slight disturbance in the ash, formed a trifecta of minor anomalies, each individually negligible, yet together suggestive of subtle intrusion, a departure from habitual practice that no ordinary accident could explain. He paused, letting his thoughts gather. The patterns of Adrian Grant's life were precise. Every morning the same routine, every evening predictable in habit. Anything that broke that rhythm, however faintly, could indicate interference, something external or something internal masked in the guise of normalcy. Alain understood that these minor ruptures often contained more truth than any direct testimony. Turning toward the armchair, he noted the position of the artist's hands. Relaxed, yet the fingers bore an unusual tension, the slightest curl as if resistance had occurred in the final moments. It was a gesture almost imperceptible, yet consistent with a subtle struggle, the kind that might be concealed entirely by a body in repose. Alain made a mental note, silent and precise. The sketch pad on the desk caught his attention next. It was closed, its pages untouched this evening, yet the corner bore a faint impression, letters or a sketch perhaps, produced by contact earlier in the day. Alain traced the impression with his eye alone, noting the direction of the pressure. In these subtle depressions, the artist's final movements whispered their story, small, deliberate, and remarkably telling. Alain finally returned to the hearth, letting his gaze wander over the room as a whole. The scene was elegant, restrained, and ordinary in appearance, But he knew better. Within the quiet order lay disruption. Within the familiar patterns lay anomaly. And it was in the anomaly that the key to understanding Adrian Grant's final moments resided. As he left the study, closing the door with soft care, Alain felt the familiar stirrings of insight, the quiet intuition that the smallest, almost imperceptible departures from ritual often revealed more than overt actions ever could. Outside, in the dim corridors and polished gallery, the guests continued their cautious dances, unaware that the minor fractures in habit and routine had already begun to map the outlines of truth. Alain, ever patient, knew that these subtle clues would guide the next steps of his inquiry. Sometimes, he reflected, it was not the grand gesture, but the tiny, almost invisible deviation from the everyday that illuminated the darkest realities of human intent. The evening deepened into a muted gray, the drizzle outside now a soft, unceasing rhythm against the tall windows of Chiswick House. Inside, the gallery retained its polished elegance, but the atmosphere had shifted. The initial shock of Adrian Grant's death had settled into a tense, almost fragile equilibrium. Guests moved with careful precision, voices lowered, smiles polite yet slightly strained. The stillness carried a weight that pressed upon every gesture, every glance. Alain, methodical and composed, observed these small disturbances with the patience that had become his hallmark. Yet just as he began to sense the outlines of social behavior settling into predictable patterns, a second ripple emerged, quieter than the first but no less significant. It began with a folded note, delivered discreetly by a trembling page boy to Lady Alicia. The envelope was unremarkable, cream with neat handwriting. She unfolded it carefully, her gloves removed, and read the single, stark line inscribed within. "Not everything is as it seems." The note caused no outburst, no dramatic gesture, yet Alan observed the faintest blanching of her cheeks, the subtle tension in her shoulders as she refolded it and tucked it into her fan. She spoke nothing of it, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. A few moments later, Clara Sewell appeared near the mantelpiece, her composure faltering for the first time. She coughed softly, then pressed a hand to her throat, as if to steady herself. Her gaze flitted toward the closed study door, and Alain noticed the tremor of her fingers as she adjusted the delicate folds of her gown. She had remained controlled until now, but the weight of the evening, the stillness, the unspoken questions, was beginning to fracture her careful facade. Sir Bertram Hollingwell's disapproval, usually restrained and carefully measured, now bore a sharper edge. He spoke quietly to Lady Margaret, his voice low but tense, and Alain noted the subtle quiver of his moustache and the tightening of his jaw. It was a restrained display, yet one that hinted at irritation and an undercurrent of anxiety. A man unused to feeling powerless within the walls of his own expectations. Alain's attention shifted, as always, to the servants. Mr. Crittenden, the butler, moved with his usual precision, yet a small crease in his forehead and the micro-hesitation of his step suggested internal deliberation. The young footman hovered uncertainly near the door to the study, a silent sentinel whose presence was almost a plea for guidance, though he said nothing. The household itself seemed to pulse with subtle tension, a quiet awareness of fracture beneath the polished veneer. Then came a whisper, scarcely audible, but enough to draw Alain's focus. A voice from the gallery's far corner, the soft rustle of a letter unfolded. He glimpsed the delicate form of Lady Margaret, holding a piece of paper with careful hands, her eyes fixed downward. She did not speak, yet the gesture itself was significant. A private acknowledgement of something unseen by the others, a ripple of anxiety conveyed through a simple act of reading. Alain observed all, yet questioned none immediately. The small disturbances, the folded note, Clara's sudden fragility, Lady Margaret's secret letter, were not dramatic, but they were charged with meaning. In this household, where etiquette governed every expression, it was in these muted shifts, in these quiet tremors beneath the surface, that truth often resided. He noted, too, the subtle interactions between guests. A brief glance between Clara and Lady Margaret, the slight stiffening of Sir Bertram's posture, the almost imperceptible hesitation of Lady Alicia as she moved toward the refreshments. Each was a tiny fracture in the cultivated calm, an echo of the initial shock amplified by suspicion, worry, or intuition. Alain allowed a faint smile to play at his lips. These ripples, silent yet persistent, were far more revealing than any loud declaration. The evening, so carefully orchestrated in manners and social grace, was beginning to reveal its true rhythm, delicate, understated, and disquieting. He made a silent note of all he had observed. Small disturbances, carefully hidden but undeniably present, were guiding him toward the undercurrents of motive, opportunity, and character. Outside, the rain continued its soft percussion, unrelenting yet unobtrusive. Inside, the quiet fractures of Chiswick House's evening promised that the night's revelations would come not with a shout, but with subtle inevitability. And Alain, as ever, watched with patient, unhurried attention. Alain withdrew to a quiet corner of the gallery, a small alcove near a side window that looked out upon the rain-darkened gardens. The gentle patter of the evening's drizzle provided a subtle counterpoint to the hum of polite conversation around him, which had now settled into an uneasy rhythm. He did not speak. He did not hurry. He simply observed, allowing impressions, fragments, and nuances to accumulate in the meticulous architecture of his mind. The death of Adrian Grant had been quiet, almost imperceptible in its violence, yet Alan's intuition whispered that the simplicity of its appearance was deceptive. He had long understood that human character often revealed motive with the subtlety of gesture and the insistence of habit. The small details he had noted, the faint disturbance of ash in the fireplace, the slightly shifted brush, the impression in the carpet, the tremor in a young handmaid's step, were not mere happenstance. They were threads, fragile but telling, in the weave of intention and opportunity. Alain allowed his gaze to roam once more over the assembled guests. Clara Sewell's fingers, pale and delicate, clutched the folds of her gown with a nervous precision. Lady Alicia, ever the picture of composed elegance, moved among her friends with an almost imperceptible tension beneath the poise. Sir Bertram Hollingwell's measured expressions betrayed a restrained anxiety, while Lady Margaret, demure and serene to outward eyes, carried a weight in the quiet gestures of her hands that betrayed private concern. The subtlety of these cues, timing, glance, hesitated word, was Alain's province. They were a form of language only discernible to those who listened with patience and a keen understanding of the social choreography in which each individual participated. And tonight, the choreography was fracturing minutely, imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. Alain considered the servants, too, their silent knowledge weaving through the household like a hidden current. Crittenden's measured movements, Mrs. Fenwick's precise, restrained demeanor, the anxious vigilance of the junior footman. They had witnessed, and they had chosen discretion. In this, Alain recognized a truth he often encountered. The careful observer frequently held the most complete picture, yet was restrained by loyalty, prudence, or habit from speaking outright. It was in this intersection of character and circumstance, between unspoken knowledge and habitual routine, that Alain sensed the shape of the mystery. He had no need yet for direct questioning. The patterns themselves, subtle as they were beginning to coalesce. The tremors in gesture and voice, the quiet departures from expected behavior, suggested relationships, tensions, and perhaps motives that would reveal themselves fully in time. Alain reflected on the evening's minor yet telling disruptions. Clara Sewell's sudden fragility, Lady Margaret's private reading, The anonymous note delivered to Lady Alicia, the small disturbances within the study. Each had seemed isolated, unremarkable in itself, yet in combination they outlined a faint but discernible trajectory. These were the whispers of human intention, the silent annunciations of what might otherwise remain unseen. He observed the interplay of glance and gesture, noting the subtle cues that would elude ordinary attention. Sir Bertram's posture, Lady Alicia's fleeting pallor, the delicate shift of Clara's gaze toward the study door, all were layers of the social fabric, worn thin in the presence of death and uncertainty. Alain catalogued these layers in his mind, assembling the quiet logic of human behavior with the precision of a scholar examining a manuscript. And yet, he did not speak. Insight, he knew, required time to settle. Rushing a conclusion would be to disrupt the natural revelation of character, to force a disclosure that might otherwise emerge organically. In this, Alain's strength lay not in compulsion, but in patience. He allowed the echoes of the evening, the tremors of anxiety, and the subtle fissures of composure to drift past him, settling like dust into the corners of his understanding. In that quiet observation, Alain felt the beginnings of certainty, not in the evidence alone, not in testimony alone, but in the convergence of psychology, habit, and social nuance. He understood that the revelation would come not with spectacle, but in a quiet, inevitable clarity, the kind that only the careful alignment of human behavior could disclose. The rain continued to trace its soft, endless rhythm across the windows, and Alain, standing with hands clasped behind his back, let the pieces settle. Like dust in sunlight, the truth was beginning to take shape, almost imperceptible, yet unavoidable in its eventual manifestation. Alain waited until the room's subdued hum of conversation had settled into near silence. The guests had resumed their positions, speaking softly, their movements measured, each gesture carefully composed to maintain the fragile equilibrium of civility. Yet beneath this polite exterior, Alain knew, currents of unease still ran, quiet, restrained, but undeniable. The time had come for the subtle step that would begin to draw these currents into the light of understanding. He requested a moment alone with Lady Alicia, who immediately inclined her head, a faint shadow of apprehension crossing her features. Alain led her through the gallery into a smaller, dimly lit drawing room adjoining the house's eastern wing. The room, lined with velvet drapes and antique portraits, was hushed except for the soft ticking of a tall grandfather clock. Here, the orchestration of social grace was unnecessary. Here, discretion could be absolute. "Lady Alicia," Alain began, his tone gentle, "I have observed much this evening, not only in the movements of your guests, but in the subtle signals of the household. The quiet fractures in behavior are often the loudest testimony one can rely upon." She drew a soft breath and nodded. "I understand, Inspector, but I am at a loss. How does one discern truth when everyone acts with such delicacy?" Alain's gaze rested on her for a long moment. Delicacy can obscure, certainly. Yet it cannot erase the consistencies of human character. Those who act, those who hesitate, those who conceal. Eventually, the pattern emerges. It is only a matter of careful attention. Lady Alicia's eyes flicked to the doorway, where a shadow from the corridor shifted faintly. Alain noted the subtle lift of her hand, the hesitation in her movement, small signs that spoke to his trained observation. "There is someone among your guests whose reactions warrant scrutiny," he said quietly. "Someone whose carefully maintained calm conceals the disturbance that has now become apparent." She blinked, a faint flush on her cheeks. "You mean, not everyone is as composed as they seem?" "Precisely," Alain replied. "And it is not always the overt actions that betray intent. Often it is the quietest gestures, the misalignment of habit, the slight tremor in a hand, the tension in a posture that reveal what words would seek to conceal. Lady Alicia drew a gentle breath, her gloved hands clasped in front of her. "And what would you have me do?" "Nothing for the moment," Alain said, inclining his head. "I do not intend to confront openly, nor to accuse publicly. It is enough to know, to observe, and to prepare for the moment when understanding may be confirmed. The household, your guests, the servants, they all play a part. Their reactions will provide what direct inquiry cannot." She nodded, absorbing the weight of his meaning. "And if I am to assist?" "Continue as you have," he said softly. "Maintain the calm, uphold the etiquette, but allow subtle cues to emerge. Watch the shifts in posture, in glance, in hesitation. Each small detail is a piece of the larger puzzle. Nothing more need be done. The revelation will come in its own time." Alain allowed a brief silence to settle, listening to the soft ticking of the clock and the distant murmur of the gallery beyond. The control of social grace, he reflected, could be a weapon as effective as any spoken accusation. Finally, he inclined his head slightly and took his leave. Returning to the gallery, he observed the guests anew. Clara Sewell, standing with controlled fragility. Sir Bertram, rigid and restrained. Lady Margaret, serene yet quietly attentive. Each of them carried the subtle echoes of unease, and each, without realizing it, was providing the puzzle pieces that would soon complete the picture. Alain moved slowly among them, his tall form blending into the shadows and light, neither interrupting nor directing, merely watching. The evening, it seemed, had reached its quiet apex, the point where anticipation balanced upon observation and where the smallest signals could alter the course of understanding. In the calm that followed, Alain felt the subtle convergence of insight and patience. He understood, with that quiet certainty that was his alone, that the threads of motive, opportunity, and character were aligning. The time for revelation was approaching, but it would not arrive with clamor or spectacle. It would emerge gently, inevitably, like dawn filtering through the heavy drapes of Chiswick House, soft, illuminating, and inescapable. Alain returned to the drawing-room once more, though this time he allowed the company of all concerned to assemble, carefully, deliberately, yet without any hint of the drama that often accompanied such revelations. Lady Alicia, Clara Sewell, Sir Bertram and Lady Margaret, and even the quietly observing servants were present. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and lilies, the soft lighting from tall sconces lending a gentle warmth that belied the tension poised within it. Alain spoke first, his voice calm, courteous, and precise. "Tonight, we have witnessed a quiet and unfortunate event," he began, allowing his words to settle without haste. "The passing of Mr. Adrian Grant has naturally produced unease among us. Yet it is the manner in which people respond, through gesture, expression, hesitation, that most often reveals the underlying currents of motive and opportunity." He paused, letting the sentence find its weight in the stillness. Guests shifted subtly. The faint rustle of silk, the soft scrape of shoe against polished floor, signaling the collective attentiveness of those present. Alain's tall figure, composed and controlled, seemed to draw the room's focus without assertion. "Through observation," he continued, "we have noted certain deviations from habit, minute and almost imperceptible, yet consistent. A brush slightly displaced, the tremor of a hand, the hesitation in speech, the careful concealment of correspondence, all small signs, but signs nonetheless, pointing to intent previously masked by propriety." Clara Sewell's hand tightened around her gown. Lady Alicia's eyes, bright and anxious, flicked toward him with the faintest question. Sir Bertram's jaw set, though he remained silent. Lady Margaret, serene as ever, simply inclined her head slightly. Alain allowed the tension to stretch, unspoken, into the room like a held breath. "It is, therefore," he said quietly, with careful consideration, that I draw attention to a particular series of observations which indicate both motive and opportunity. Not through rash accusation, not through theatrics, but through patient scrutiny and understanding of human behavior. He allowed another pause, giving the room time to absorb the measured cadence of his words. Then, turning his gaze, precise and unflinching, he addressed Sir Bertram Hollingwell. "Sir Bertram," Alain said gently, "your meticulous adherence to propriety, your constant observation of those around you, has been admirable. Yet it is precisely your knowledge of the household, your access, and the careful timing of movements tonight that align most closely with the deviations we have observed in the study." The older gentleman's composure faltered for the faintest moment. A small sigh escaped his lips, almost inaudible, but enough to betray the tension Alain had been cataloguing for hours. Alain turned next to Lady Margaret, whose serene demeanour remained intact, though her eyes reflected a subtle understanding. "And Lady Margaret," he continued softly, "your quiet management of the household, your discreet handling of correspondence and observation, has further facilitated the circumstances in which Mr. Grant's demise occurred. Not by intention of malice, perhaps, but by the careful maintenance of calm that allowed action to proceed unnoticed." Alain allowed the words to linger. The room did not erupt into shock. There were no cries or accusations. The elegance of restraint held. Yet in the measured exhalations, in the flickers of glance exchanged between husband and wife, the revelation settled with quiet inevitability. He finally addressed the assembled company as a whole. "The truth need not arrive with shouting or spectacle. It is here, recognized by those who observe, understood by those who act within the parameters of society's expectations. The consequences, the inevitable accounting, will follow as decorum allows." A silence stretched, heavy yet calm. The servants, standing at respectful attention, bore no outward expression of judgment, only the quiet dignity of their presence. The guests, composed yet inwardly aware, allowed themselves to absorb the inevitability of understanding, the soft certainty that the subtle threads of observation had revealed what could not remain hidden. Alain inclined his head, the faintest trace of a smile upon his lips. Justice had not been loud, nor had guilt been forcibly exposed. Instead, understanding had emerged, quiet, precise, and elegantly inevitable. Outside, the rain persisted in gentle, unrelenting rhythm, as though marking the passage of events with a soft, consistent cadence. Inside, Chiswick House returned, at last, to its delicate balance of civility and restraint. The fractures had been observed, the truth had been laid bare, and the evening's tensions began to settle like dust, leaving only the soft gleam of comprehension behind. Alain allowed himself a measured exhalation, the smallest acknowledgment that the quiet labor of observation had borne fruit. In the world of manners, subtlety, and human nuance, revelation often arrived in whispers, and tonight it had spoken. The gallery, once again quiet, seemed to breathe a cautious calm. The revelations that Alain had delivered softly, without the clamor of accusation, had settled like a fine layer of dust over the assembled guests. Sir Bertram and Lady Margaret remained composed outwardly, yet in the faint, almost imperceptible exchange of glances, Alain detected the weight of unspoken understanding. It was a quiet reckoning, one that required no dramatic declarations, only the recognition of inevitability. The butler, Mr. Crittenden, moved among the servants with an almost imperceptible adjustment of posture, signaling the resumption of household order. Their knowledge of the events, carefully measured and discreet, remained intact. They would bear witness without comment, protect the dignity of the household, and preserve the subtle framework of social expectation. Alain, ever patient, observed the delicate shift in dynamics. The outcome was not one of loud justice, nor of theatrical punishment. In the subdued elegance of Chiswick House, consequences unfolded with quiet inevitability. Sir Bertram's authority, intact yet diminished by the private understanding of his involvement, had to be reconciled with social propriety. Lady Margaret, serene in appearance, bore the subtle weight of accountability with characteristic poise. The moral calculus of their roles, the interplay of responsibility, intention, and consequence, was acknowledged without words in the shared language of civility and restraint. Alain approached the couple with his customary courtesy. "Sir Bertram, Lady Margaret," he said gently. "The events of this evening have been clarified through observation, deduction, and careful attention to character and circumstance. The truth need not be shouted. It exists quietly, as does the responsibility that accompanies it." Sir Bertram inclined his head slowly, the faintest exhalation betraying his private acknowledgement. Lady Margaret's hands, folded in front of her, remained still, yet a subtle tension suggested an inner reckoning. No denial, no argument, only the recognition that civility and consequence need not be antagonistic. The guests, observing the quiet exchange, absorbed the delicate balance of accountability and decorum. Clara Sewell, who had spent much of the evening in constrained agitation, now relaxed slightly, her comprehension of the situation tempered by the gentle authority of Alain's method. Lady Alicia, ever mindful of her role as hostess, allowed the understanding to settle without interference, preserving both order and propriety. Alain reflected silently on the nature of justice in such a household. It was not always a matter of formal arrest, of public censure, or of overt punishment. Sometimes it was the subtle, inevitable acknowledgement of responsibility, the quiet recognition that actions, however carefully concealed beneath the veneer of manners, bore consequences that could not be ignored. In this, the elegance of restraint and the inevitability of understanding became intertwined. He observed the final microcosms of response, the slight relaxation of Sir Bertram's shoulders, the controlled composure of Lady Margaret's face, the careful retreat of servants to their stations, all gestures that spoke of acceptance without fanfare. In their own way, they had enacted a form of justice as intricate and precise as any legal proceeding, executed within the silent, codified framework of social expectation. Alain's mind catalogued the subtle ironies of the evening, the quiet elegance that masked fracture, the minute deviations from routine that had revealed intention, and the inevitability of consequence that had unfolded without spectacle. In this household, in this society, morality and propriety were inseparable, and truth often required the patience to observe, rather than the force of accusation to declare. The rain outside continued to trace its persistent path along the window panes, unhurried, gentle, and inevitable. Alain noted the sound as he moved slowly among the guests, each step measured, each gesture understated. The evening had reached a resolution in which justice was not sensational, yet it had occurred. It was subtle, precise, and quietly unavoidable. As he prepared to leave the room, Alain allowed himself the faintest reflection. In a world bound by manners, observation, and the muted currents of human behavior, consequences were rarely shouted. They arrived softly, like the whisper of rain on glass, unavoidable and quietly acknowledged by all who witnessed them. The night had grown deep and still. Chiswick House, now settled into its customary quietude, seemed almost unchanged by the events that had unfolded within its walls. Yet Alain knew better. Beneath the veneer of polished wood, gilt frames, and carefully arranged vases, the subtle fissures of human behavior had been traced, examined, and understood. The truth, though quietly revealed, had left an indelible mark upon those who remained. Alain stood for a moment in the gallery, alone, observing the empty spaces where guests had departed for the evening. Lady Alicia had retired to her private chambers, preserving the outward calm expected of her station. Sir Bertram and Lady Margaret had withdrawn to the drawing-room, their conversation muted, deliberate, and measured. Even Clara Sewell, her youthful fragility softened into a tentative composure, had been escorted to her quarters. The household and its denizens had resumed their positions within the rhythms of polite society, yet Alan knew that beneath the practiced elegance, awareness, and understanding lingered like a faint perfume, impossible to remove. He reflected on the small anomalies that had guided him. The displaced brush, the subtle tremor in a hand, the faint impressions in carpet and ash, the carefully concealed note, the silent yet significant gestures of the servants. Each had been insignificant in isolation, yet in combination they had revealed the quiet architecture of intent, opportunity, and human vulnerability. And at the center of it all had been the delicate interplay between Sir Bertram and Lady Margaret, an unspoken dynamic of control, fear, and responsibility, expressed with a restraint that spoke volumes without uttering a single accusation aloud. Alain's insight had relied not on spectacle, nor on confrontation, but on patience and careful observation. He had noted gestures, silences, and deviations from routine. He had read the subtle language of human behavior, attentive to the echoes of anxiety and the whispers of motive. It was in the smallest details, the microcosms of propriety and hesitation, that truth had been found, and it was revealed with the quiet inevitability that was characteristic of justice tempered by discretion. The inspector's gaze lingered upon the study door, now locked and still. It seemed to him a threshold not merely of space, but of circumstance, a boundary between the apparent and the actual, between public propriety and private intention. The death of Adrian Grant had been elegant in its restraint, terrible in its quietness, and deeply instructive in the ways that human character both conceals and betrays itself. Outside, the rain continued its unceasing rhythm, a gentle percussion against the leaded windows. Alain allowed the sound to fill the empty gallery, a soft, unrelenting witness to the passage of events. In it, he discerned a kind of symmetry, the inevitability of human action, the consequences of carefully measured deeds, and the quiet unfolding of truth within the disciplined framework of society. He paused, reflecting on the lessons of the evening. Human behavior, he thought, was often a study in restraint, in subtle pressures that build beneath the polished surface of civility. It was rarely the loud, the obvious, or the violent that revealed character most clearly, but rather the whispered hesitations, the fleeting glances, and the careful deviations from ordinary habit. In Chiswick House, these nuances had spoken more clearly than words ever could. Alain exhaled slowly, the faintest smile crossing his lips. He knew that life would continue within the household as before. Social gatherings, measured conversations, and the polished rhythm of daily routines. But the knowledge of the evening would linger, intangible yet undeniable. The guests would maintain their appearances, the servants their discretion, and yet each would carry a private acknowledgement of what had transpired. And for Alain himself, there was a quiet satisfaction in this understanding. Justice had not been loud, nor had guilt been dragged into the light by force. It had emerged softly, inevitably, and with the precision of careful observation. That, he reflected, was the most telling and enduring form of resolution. He turned once more to the gallery, noting the shadows that stretched along the walls, the faint gleam of polished surfaces, the silence that now held the room in its embrace. Here, amidst elegance, restraint, and the quiet weight of human subtlety, Alain recognized the enduring truth of his work, that the world's hidden fissures are often illuminated not by force, but by patient, measured observation, and that in such illumination, even the quietest of deaths leaves a story both complete and inescapable. With that, he walked slowly toward the door, leaving, Chiswick House to its slumbering calm, the soft rain as the only witness to a night in which manners, vigilance, and quiet intellect had triumphed over disorder, revealing truth in the most understated, elegant form imaginable.